2015, we were probably doing like 1 mil rev. We were maybe 10, 15 people. And then we had a bit of a change of direction.
Coming up on Now That's It.
So I went from being tech director to running the business.
Dan Kitchen, CEO of Razorblue Group, talks about the challenges of starting an MSP.
You've grown up with these people and they've grown up and they've worked with you and they've supported you along that journey. You sort of feel like you've got to bring them along the journey, even if it's not the right thing to do.
And how successfully scaling their business has opened them up to new opportunities.
We've been able to bid for business that if we were still a more regional player, even if we'd been a bigger regional player, we wouldn't have been able to win.
Welcome to Now That's It, Stories of MSP Success, where we dive into the journeys of some of the trailblazers in our industry to find out how they used their passion for technology to help turn managed services into the thriving sector it is today.
Dan, really appreciate you being here, talking to us. Why don't you just start out, tell us a little bit about your background and maybe, how you got started as a managed service provider.
Yeah, sure. So my background's tech. So I was always interested in it from a young age. I was doing a lot of web hosting business when I was younger. So I had some servers out in New York and was building a web hosting business. Sort of quickly realized web hosting is not great margin. It's a bit of a race to the bottom. And then that's when I started to get into the consulting space. Managed services wasn't really a thing then. This was like sort of 2007, 2008.
Sure.
And I met another guy who was sort of on that managed services journey to, building what would become MSPs. We joined our businesses together and we started to hire some people. And I was still technical, pure technical at that point. I'd done we were selling cloud, what was cloud before the cloud existed.
Yep.
Some servers in a data center and that sort of thing. We were doing that. So I built that. We became an ISP. So I built the ISP core network, got us our IP addresses and all that sort of stuff and our AS number and did the transit peering, that sort of thing. So that was like my world. And it grew from there really. But I think our growth was fairly static. We got to 2015, we were probably doing like 1 mil revenue, something like that. We were maybe 10, 15 people at that point. And then we had a bit of a change of direction. So Chris, who was my business partner at the time, he wanted to be doing something a bit different. He didn't want to grow quite as aggressively as I did.
Mm-hmm.
So we went our separate ways. I bought his share of the business out and he went off to do something else. And then I had to do all sorts of stuff that I'd not really had too much experience with at this point.
Sure.
So I went from being tech director to running the business.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, finance, HR, all these different things.
Wow.
And that was interesting.
Talk a little bit about that. I mean, number one, I heard two big things there. You were sort of the tech guy for a long time. And then there was a point where you had to take a step out of that and be more of all right, I'm going to run at least the tech side of the company, but not be the guy that's actually fixing things. So that was a big maturity, right? A big step. And then another one here, a while later where you're the guy, right? I mean, you're sort of taking over. So talk about you from a professional perspective. I mean, what were you going through? What were you thinking through in those two sort of big jumps?
I guess I took it in my stride.
Yeah.
I didn't really know, I didn't really know what I didn't know at that point.
Sure.
And it was a case of just, learning about all this stuff. I mean, the company buyout thing was new to me in terms of, share purchase agreements and all that sort of stuff. The finance stuff was relatively new to me and trying to, get my head around that and having to understand, how a profit and loss and a balance sheet all tied together and those sort of things. But a lot self-taught with some advice from people around me. But yeah.
Awesome. Talk about, as the company grew, you merged two companies, but you've done some more M&A since then, haven't you?
Yeah. We've done in more recent years, we've done another 2 deals.
That's great.
So we did an acquisition in Manchester and then we did one in Scotland. That was about 18 months ago. So these are all sort of in the last 4 or 5 years. And the ambition with that was we wanted to grow geographically. And actually that's worked really well for us because it's given us more of a national platform. And through having that more national platform, we've been able to bid for business that if we were still a more regional player, even if we'd been a bigger regional player, we wouldn't have been able to win. So
that's great. You talk a little bit about when you were going through those M&A you had some involvement with the growth strategists and then enable folks. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like and how they helped?
Yeah, I mean, they were great. They gave us some advice on how to grow and how other MSPs had done it.
Sure.
Really, I think one of the things that you lack in the marketplace is everybody plays their cards very close to their chest in terms of, you know, how they've got there and how they've achieved and what worked and what didn't work. And actually, the Enable folks have been really great at sort of sharing that knowledge from experience they've got from other Enable partners.
That's great, Dan. Let's talk about, you know, obviously as you've grown the company, there's obviously been some challenges along the way, and you shared some, you know, from your professional career, moving into different roles. But what are some of the other things that the companies maybe run into from a challenge perspective, and how did you overcome some of those?
I think when you're growing quite aggressively, you can outgrow people, and I think that's a bit of a challenge. You know, you might have someone who was doing a great job when you were 10, 15, 20 users, you know, or 20 employees, I suppose. But then when you get to 100, when you get to 150, they're maybe not the right person for that job anymore. They're the right person to have the business,
right?
But doing something different. And I think that's quite a big challenge, because obviously, you know, particularly when you've grown a business from nothing to where it is, you've grown up with these people, and they've grown up and they've worked with you and they've supported you along that journey. So, you know, you sort of feel, you know, you sort of feel like you've got to bring them along the journey, even if it's not the right thing to do.
Right. That's great. I can relate to that from my past experiences. You know, folks that had been with us since the beginning that might have been doing professional services and trying to move them over into managed services and getting them in that train of thought, you know, this is different. This is good for you. But, you know, they've been doing something else for a really long time. So I can relate to that for sure. That I agree. That's a big challenge. So let's talk a little bit about, so we call this is a podcast that we call, you know, now that's it. And really the question that I want to ask you now is, when was the point in your career here, and especially the point in Razorblue where you said, you know, now that's it. We've figured it out. Like, we're doing the right thing. We're creating the right offering. We have the right partners. What was that point?
I think there's probably multiple different points, but I don't know. Sometimes, you know, it can be good, and you walk into the business and you go, you know, we've got our 24/7 operations center. It's working. It's running. You know, we're chewing through, you know, 600-700 tickets a day. The sales team are bringing in opportunities, things that I didn't know about. You know, the finance team are doing what they need to do. The professional services team are pulling off huge projects, and, you know, I don't really know much about them. That's the sort of thing I think you go, yeah, the machine is working.
Yep. The machine you built that has continued to evolve and get better, it's working well. That's great. That's a good example.
Insight covers the full breadth of device types and operating systems. So we cover Windows, servers and workstations, of course. We cover Apple, macOS and iOS devices. We cover Linux, including even Raspberry Pis. And we also cover network devices. And it's really easy to install the different device types. Here you can see I select the operating system that I want to create the agent for. I run this on the endpoint and it will install that device. From there, I can apply features such as patch management, managed antivirus, endpoint detection and response. I can also use remote access to remotely connect to those device types to help my customers and their users out on a day-to-day basis. In addition, with network devices, we cover printers, routers, switches, firewalls, etc. And it's very easy to add. With just a couple of clicks, I can bring a network device under monitoring, and I can add custom SNMP checks. And we also add some out-of-the-box checks for certain device types, for example, this printer. So really easy to get started with, easy to deploy. And it means that as an MSP, you don't have to partner with multiple vendors to cover all the different device monitoring requirements.
So let's talk a little bit about, you know, maybe prospecting, and really the key piece is when you acquire a new client, a new customer, what's that like for you guys, and how do you sort of build that trust with this new business so that they understand that they're in the right hands?
You've got to impress them from day one. I think that's really important. Our onboarding process is pretty robust in terms of all the steps that we go through. And as soon as we get in there, we want to deliver a strategy with them in terms of what they need to do, what they need to invest in, how they need to improve their tech landscape. But I think you earn that trust in probably that first 90 days. And if you fail, then that customer's not going to stay with you for very long. You've got to make it work very, very smoothly. And that's, that's everybody's responsibility in our organization. That's, from, finance to open the new account, from the onboarding team, from project management to account management. So we have two different teams we have sales and we have account management. And there's a handover that's got to happen between that. All those teams have got to do a really, really good job to impress that customer.
Yeah, that's great. I remember that as well. It's making that impression and setting expectations early too, I think is really key when you're building that trust. Customer service is obviously important to all MSPs. And so I just wanted to sort of hear from you from a Razorblue perspective. How do you treat customer service? What are the things you look at and how do you ensure you're delivering that level of customer service to the client?
We've done a few things. We live by Net Promoter Score. So we send ours out religiously. We put a lot of work into simplifying that so that we get a lot of feedback. We get sort of like a 40% response rate to feedback we sent out, which is really, really good.
Amazing.
And we've got a dedicated customer success team. So they are there purely not to do anything with account management, just to make customers happy. And that works well because it can, we can look at issues from a totally agnostic point of view and go, right, what do we need to do to make this better? I think they're probably the two key things I would say.
Those are great. Really good examples. Let's talk about evolution. So what's sort of, how's the business evolved over the years and what types of different clients have you taken on or different technical levels or technologies? Just how's the evolution evolved?
I think sort of skills wise, we've had to develop a lot of new skills. Obviously cloud technologies are moving way faster than any of us know.
Sure.
Microsoft decided to add new features and the clients find out about them the same time that we do. So that evolution is huge. And I suppose it's quite difficult going from having skill sets in a particular area to that sort of broad spectrum. So if you take someone who's I guess what you call like an infrastructure engineer, maybe like 5 years ago, they knew everything about everything. But now you've got specialisms, you've got cloud specialisms, you've got security specialisms, infrastructure, network, end user compute. These are all different skill sets. And although we've got some people who are multi-skilled, you don't tend to find people who've got all these same skills in one person. It's very, very rare because there's just so much to know. And that's a challenge to resource for and recruit for, that sort of thing.
Speaking of that, how have you guys found talent in the industry and how have you kept talent?
I think to keep talent, you've got to be good to work for.
Yeah.
And that's something we put a lot of effort into. Working for an MSP is not easy. And I don't think there's any MSP job out there where you can walk into somewhere and it's walk in at 9, leave at 5 and everything's great. It's hard work. But I think you've got to build a community spirit. And when you're working late on projects and that sort of thing, the team have got to be on board with that, and they've got to be, they've got to be bought into the cause and celebrate the achievements when they complete. So that's probably a good take on the retention side. In terms of recruitment, it's still very difficult. And I think it's probably got a lot to do with the fact that there's a lot of the competition and other partners of yours out there that are investing very heavily in their own staff because they want to retain them too.
Yep.
So that's a difficulty. We have built our own academy, which has helped us build new talent in the sort of end user compute, service desk, first line part of the world. And then hopefully they do develop into second line and, then start to specialize in particular areas post that. But it's still a challenge because we need skill more quickly than it's available.
I always say that an MSP technician is a special breed of human. I can count the number of Christmas Eves and New Year's Eves and on calls over dinner that I had to leave. And so, I'm glad that not only you obviously recognize that, but that you appreciate that when those types of things happen. And I would agree, when MSPs that do, again, recognize and appreciate and reward that sort of extra level of attention to detail and commitment, they're going to stay for a long time.
Well, we've done quite a lot around that, and it's because of our size and scale now that we've gone from having on-call teams to having dedicated teams in a lot of areas that now work shifts 24/7. So it has given people a bit more of their life, work-life balance back. There's still areas that it's quite difficult to do that for, because there are certain infrastructure specialisms and network specialisms that things only happen one day of 365.
Right.
So it doesn't make sense to have somebody sat there doing nothing for the rest of those days. But I think that's certainly helped alleviate some of those pressures.
That's great. Well, talk a little bit about the future. What's sort of next for Razorblue, and what's the direction that the company's headed? And more M&A, more organic growth, a little bit of both? What's it look like?
Probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think because we're privately owned and we're not private equity backed, we haven't got a ticking clock that we've got to work towards. So we'll invest and reinvest and probably continue that organic growth journey. We've also got some M&A we want to do. We've got particular target areas where we're looking for other acquisitions, but we're not in a rush to do any deals. It needs to be the right deal for everybody. And then I think it's really interesting because you speak to the bank and they'll say, we want to see the 5-year plan. And we're going, we can't give you a 5-year plan because tech is moving so fast right now. It's completely pointless. I think, the advances in AI that we've been talking about here are unbelievable. And where we've got in probably less than a year from, where we were a year ago is insane. So I think we've got to watch the space very carefully. We've got to get on board with it. And we've got to make the best use of the tech in the right ways. But I certainly couldn't tell you where we'll be in 3 years' time. And it's going to be interesting, I think.
That's great. Dan, it was a real pleasure. I really appreciate you being here. And I wish you and Razorblue a ton of luck in the future and best wishes. And thank you just so very much for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
To receive updates about future episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform, and follow Enable on LinkedIn. We appreciate your support and encourage you to leave a rating or review, as it helps us reach more listeners who can benefit from the wealth of knowledge shared on this show. Remember, success is not a destination, it's a journey. And by immersing yourself in the stories of those who have walked the path before you, you'll gain the tools, inspiration, and confidence to achieve your own triumphs. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes of Now That's It, Stories of MSP Success. This podcast provides educational information about issues that may be relevant to information technology service providers. Nothing in the podcast should be construed as any recommendation or endorsement by Enable or as legal or any other advice. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by Enable employees are those of the employees and do not necessarily reflect the view of Enable or its officers and directors. This podcast may also contain forward-looking statements regarding future product plans, functionality, or developmental efforts that should not be interpreted as a commitment from Enable related to any deliverables or timeframe. All content is based on information available at the time of recording, and Enable has no obligation to update any forward-looking statements.